In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains how we interpret our reality.
And so we'll go through a brief picture of how the brain works. And so one of the ways of, so you can look at the brain from front to back, and you can divide it roughly into two sections. And one section has to do with sensory processing, and that's roughly the back half. And one section has to do with motor output. Now those things aren't as clearly differentiated as you might think, because there's very little sensation without motor output. Maybe the closest to an exception is smell, I would say, but you at least have to breathe in, you know, and when an animal is actively searching out a scent trail, it's breathing in. So it's using its motor output constantly to modify the sensory stream. It's really difficult to dissociate the two. And when you're looking at something, you know, it kind of feels to you like you're a passive recipient of sense data, but you're no such thing. Your eyes are moving back and forth in multiple ways all the time, including the ways that you can control voluntarily. So there's multiple involuntary systems that are moving your eyes in multiple ways. And really what you're doing is feeling the array of the electromagnetic spectrum with your eyes. You're feeling it, and you're actively exploring it. You're not a passive recipient at all. So even in sensation, you can't purely pull sensation out from motor processing and say, I'm getting untrammeled, unbiased sense data. Because you can't look at something without focusing. And you can't focus without wanting to look at something. You know, you can't just lie there with your, well, you could, with your eyes half crossed, but, you know, that's sort of like, imagine you dropped a video recorder from an airplane and it just spun around in an unfocused manner. Well, that's the world sampled randomly. You know, what are you going to do with that? Nothing. And you know, you're concentrating on the auditory stream constantly and segregating out some things and suppressing others. Like if you listen in the classroom, you can hear probably 4 or 5 different types of mechanical noise going on at the same time. Most of the time in the classroom, that's silent. You don't hear it, like you don't hear your fridge except when it turns on or off, right? You zero that out. And so you're very selective in your perception. So you can't really technically separate out motor output from sensory input. And that's really useful to know, because it destroys the idea that you're just that there's a world of sensation out there that's imprinting itself on you, and that's how you get your information, which is really that's the fundamental presupposition of the empiricists, of the raw empiricists. There's a world of sense data out there, you sample it randomly, and that's what informs you. It's like, yes, except that you're always an active harvester of the information. So you can't get rid of the interpretive structure a priori. That was Immanuel Kant, by the way, who first established that in his Critique of Pure Reason. You can't get away from the fact that you're actively harvesting the data. So you can say, well, where does human structure come from? The sense data. That's sort of the blank slate idea. It's like, no, wrong. Because a blank slate cannot process information. You're actively engaged right at the beginning. So that's another example of the knower and the unknown, you know, working in this cyclical manner. Because you interact with something, you divide it up into you and the world, roughly speaking. And I mean, you really make it that way because you build yourself out of the information. And then, of course, that makes you a more differentiated processor with a broader range of skills. Then you interact with the unknown again, you gather more information, it differentiates the world, it makes you a more differentiated harvester, and then, so it's just continually cycling. And that consciousness, the logos, the knower, is that thing that's doing that harvesting. And you can never say it's not there. Now, what happens is that it's in its nascent form to begin with, low resolution nascent form. Low resolution knower, low resolution category system, low resolution world. But that's enough to kickstart it and to start it differentiating. And that happens as you develop as an individual, because you start out as a single-celled organism for all intents and purposes, a very low resolution thing in a very low resolution world, and that differentiates itself across time, but exactly the same thing happened over evolutionary time. So there isn't a time when those 3 elements aren't there for all intents and purposes. They're always there. They're permanent. Okay, so anyways, back to the brain. Sensory unit, that's the back half, roughly speaking. Huge chunk of that is devoted to visual processing in human beings, right? Most animals organized around smell, not us. Somewhat, still, because smell is a very powerful evoker of memories, and it has a direct relationship with emotional systems, because you need to know if something is edible or inedible, terrible or good, very, very rapidly. But human beings are organized around vision, so we have a massive amounts of our cortex devoted to differentiated visual processing. Now, the motor unit, so what you have is each of these little zones here. So for example, look at the back here, that's the primary visual area and the secondary visual area, and then this is the primary auditory area in the middle of the brain here on the outside, and the secondary auditory area, and then this is for body representation, the primary area and the secondary area. And you can think about those areas of primary, secondary, and then tertiary. Primary does the base level processing. Tertiary expands that up into more abstract representation, or secondary expands that up into more abstract representations, and tertiary are the areas where the senses come together. And that's really what you seem to be most conscious of, right? It's action in the tertiary areas, because you don't really see the world as a separate, you can think about the auditory stream separate from the visual stream and all of that, and you can think about touch separately, but you tend to consciously experience things as a unity, as a comprehensive unity of all the senses simultaneously. So consciousness seems to occur only at the, most of the time at the highest level of integration. And Luria would have associated consciousness more with the tertiary areas where the senses are talking to one another. Now it's more complicated than that, because there's obviously subcortical structures all the way down to the spine that are involved heavily in what consciousness is. It's not merely a consequence of cortical activity. You know, we tend to think that because human beings have massively expanded cortical structures, and we think of ourselves as the most conscious creatures, and that's reasonable, but you can take an awful lot of cortex off someone and they're still conscious. In fact, you can leave them with almost no brain at all and they're still conscious. So we really have a rough time trying to figure out what consciousness is and how it's related to brain structure. So anyways, so that's the sensory unit. And then the motor unit, you have the primary unit, the secondary unit, and the premotor, or the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is particularly huge in human beings. So imagine that it's this primary and secondary areas that allow you to first of all to act voluntarily, and then to play around in some sense with your actions. You know, like imagine that you're a child building with Legos, and you can think with the Legos without really having to think abstractly, right? Because you can play around and build different sorts of structures, and so you can think at the level, at a level of motor output without having to depend on abstraction. But if you develop the prefrontal cortex here, which emerged out of the motor and premotor areas over the course of evolution, so it's a differentiation of those structures. So this is dealing with the real world. This is dealing mostly with the real world, but starting to abstract and experiment a little bit. And then this part deals with abstractions, pure and simple.